I never imagined that a simple credit card statement would unravel 23 years of carefully constructed lies and lead me to discover that everything I believed about my family was wrong. My name is Sarah, and I'm 33 years old now, but this story begins when I was just 10 on an autumn day in a small town in Michigan that changed the course of my entire life. That was the day my twin sister Grace supposedly died, though as I would learn decades later, death was just the first of many lies my mother Margaret would tell me. Growing up, I had always felt like half of me was missing, like I was walking through life with a phantom limb that ached in ways I could never quite explain to therapists or friends, or the string of boyfriends who tried to understand why I always kept one foot out the door. Grace and I had been inseparable, two halves of the same whole, finishing each other's sentences and sharing dreams that seemed to flow between us like water. We had our own language, our own world, and when she disappeared, it was as if someone had torn me in half and expected me to keep functioning with just the pieces that remained. The official story, the one my mother Margaret told the police and the newspapers and anyone who would listen, was that Grace and I had been walking home from school along the old canal path when a stranger grabbed her. I had supposedly fallen and hit my head trying to help her, which explained why I couldn't remember anything about that day. The doctors called it trauma-induced amnesia, and everyone seemed to accept that explanation, including me, for 23 long years. We moved away from Michigan shortly after, settling in a quiet suburb outside Denver, where no one knew our story, and my mother could pretend we were just another normal family starting over. Margaret never wanted to talk about Grace, and whenever I tried to bring up memories or ask questions, she would get this distant look in her eyes and change the subject. Usually to something practical like what we needed from the grocery store or whether I had finished my homework. She refused therapy for both of us, saying that dwelling on the past wouldn't bring Grace back and that the best thing we could do was move forward. So I learned to swallow my questions and my grief, to pack away my memories of Grace like old clothes that no longer fit, though they never stopped haunting me. I would dream about her sometimes, vivid dreams, where we were 10 again and running through fields of wildflowers, her laughter ringing out like bells. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of her in mirrors, just for a second, standing where my reflection should be. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that grief could make you see things that weren't there, but part of me always wondered if she was trying to tell me something from wherever she had gone. The years passed in a blur of normalcy that never quite felt normal. I went to college, got a degree in marketing, had relationships that felt like I was playing a role rather than living a life. I moved to Seattle after graduation, putting even more distance between myself and the memories, though they followed me anyway. I built a career, had friends, went to yoga classes and book clubs, but there was always this underlying current of wrongness, like I was living someone else's life while waiting for my real one to begin. Everything changed 3 months ago when my 5-year relationship with David fell apart. He was a good man, patient and kind, but he finally got tired of competing with a ghost he couldn't see. He told me I was never really present, that even when I was with him, part of me was somewhere else, searching for something I couldn't name. He wasn't wrong, and that's what hurt the most. I couldn't give him what he deserved because I had never learned how to be whole. So I did what I had sworn I would never do and moved back home to Denver, back to my mother's house with its perfectly maintained garden and rooms that still smelled faintly of the lavender sachets she tucked into every drawer. Margaret welcomed me with open arms and careful eyes, making up the guest room and filling the refrigerator with my favorite foods from childhood, as if feeding me enough casseroles could somehow fill the empty spaces inside me. It was strange being back in that house, surrounded by family photos that had been carefully edited to exclude any trace of Grace. Margaret had become an expert at revisionist history, creating a narrative where it had always been just the two of us. But I knew where to look for the gaps, the slightly off-center family portraits where someone had been cropped out, the kitchen table that was too big for just 2 people, the way Margaret sometimes set out 3 coffee mugs before catching herself. I had been home for about a week when I noticed the locked drawer in Margaret's home office. She worked as a freelance accountant now, keeping the books for small businesses from her meticulously organized workspace. The drawer wasn't hidden or anything, just a simple lock on the bottom drawer of her filing cabinet, but something about it nagged at me. When I asked her about it, she brushed me off, saying it was just old tax documents, nothing interesting, and did I want to help her make dinner? Life settled into a routine of sorts. I applied for jobs, went on interviews, helped Margaret with her garden, and tried to figure out what came next. The locked drawer faded into the background of my mind, just another small mystery in a house full of them. Then, 3 weeks into my stay, I got a fraud alert on my phone about an Amazon purchase being shipped to an address in Illinois that I didn't recognize. When I logged into my Amazon account to investigate, I found a credit card linked to it that wasn't mine. The name on the card made my blood run cold. Grace M. Henderson, my sister's name, with our mother's maiden name as the last name. My hands shook as I scrolled through the purchase history. This wasn't a case of identity theft or some sick joke. There were years of purchases on this card, everyday things like groceries and clothes and books, pharmacy prescriptions and therapy copays, all being shipped to or purchased in a small town called Millbrook, about 200 miles from Denver. My mind raced as I tried to process what I was seeing. Grace was supposed to be dead, had been dead for 23 years, according to everyone who mattered. But dead people didn't buy groceries or go to therapy or order books about healing from trauma. Dead people didn't have active credit cards in their names, which meant either someone was using my dead sister's identity or Grace wasn't dead at all. I confronted Margaret that evening, trying to keep my voice steady as I showed her the credit card statement on my phone. She glanced at it briefly, her face giving away nothing, and told me it was an old charity account she had set up in Grace's memory, that sometimes these things got mixed up in the system. Then she asked if I wanted spaghetti or lasagna for dinner, as if we were discussing nothing more important than meal planning. But I had lived with Margaret long enough to recognize her tells. The way she couldn't quite meet my eyes, the way her hands fluttered nervously to her hair. She was lying, and we both knew it. When she announced the next morning that she was going to visit her sister in Phoenix for the weekend, I knew it was her way of avoiding further questions. She left Friday afternoon with a kiss on my cheek and a reminder to water the plants, and I waited exactly 10 minutes after her car disappeared around the corner before I went to work on that locked drawer. The lock was old and simple, the kind that could be opened with a bent paperclip if you knew what you were doing. Lucky for me, I had learned a few things during my rebellious teenage years. The drawer opened with a soft click, and I held my breath as I pulled it open, not sure what I expected to find. What I discovered was so much more than I could have imagined. The drawer was filled with letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Margaret, but sent from different cities across the Midwest. The return addresses were always different, but the handwriting was the same on every envelope. My hands trembled as I recognized it. It was Grace's handwriting, older and more mature than the childhood scrawl I remembered, but unmistakably hers. She had always made her lowercase a's with a little curl at the top, a quirk that apparently hadn't changed. I spread the letters out on the floor, organizing them by postmark date. The earliest ones were from about 5 years after Grace's supposed death, written in the shaky hand of a teenager. They were short, cautious, asking if it was safe to write, if Margaret still thought it was necessary to keep the secret. As the years went on, the letters became longer, more confident. Grace wrote about her life in various treatment facilities, about the therapy sessions and the medications, and the slow process of learning to manage what she called her episodes. There were photographs too, tucked between the letters like pressed flowers. Grace at different ages, always in institutional settings but smiling, trying to look normal for the camera. In one, she was holding a handmade card that read, "Happy 18th to my mirror," and I had to put it down because my hands were shaking too hard to hold it steady. She had remembered me, had been thinking of me all these years while I thought she was dead. At the bottom of the drawer was a notebook, spiral-bound and worn from handling. I opened it to find Margaret's handwriting filling the pages, a kind of journal or confession that made my stomach turn as I read it. She had written about her decision to fake Grace's death, about how it was the only way to protect both of us from what Grace had done. She wrote about the elaborate scene she had staged, drugging me with sleeping pills so I wouldn't remember, creating false evidence of an abduction, lying to the police and the media and everyone who tried to help us find my missing sister. The truth, according to Margaret's journal, was that Grace had hurt someone, a neighbour's baby, who had died under mysterious circumstances. Margaret insisted that Grace hadn't meant to do it, that she had just gotten angry and lost control, but that no one would understand. Rather than risk Grace being institutionalized through the legal system, where she would be labeled a killer for the rest of her life, Margaret had decided to make her disappear and create a new identity for her somewhere she could get help without the stigma of what had happened. I sat on the floor of that office for hours, reading and rereading the letters and journal entries, trying to reconcile this version of events with the story I had believed for more than 2 decades. The sister I had mourned, whose absence had shaped every aspect of my adult life, was alive and living in Illinois under an assumed name. The mother I had trusted had orchestrated an elaborate deception that had torn our family apart. And somewhere in all of this was the truth about what had really happened to that baby, a truth that Margaret had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide. As the sun set and the room grew dark, I made my decision. I couldn't wait for Margaret to come back and spin more lies. I needed to find Grace, to see her with my own eyes, and understand why our mother had thought this was the only solution. I packed a bag, left a note saying I was visiting a college friend, and drove through the night toward Millbrook, Illinois, and the sister I had thought was dead. The drive gave me too much time to think, to cycle through anger and grief and hope and fear until I didn't know what I was feeling anymore. What would I say to Grace when I found her? Did she even know I existed, or had Margaret told her some lie to explain why her twin sister never came to visit? Was she dangerous, as Margaret's journal suggested, or just a sick child who had needed help? And what was I hoping to accomplish by showing up unannounced in her life after all these years? Millbrook turned out to be one of those small Midwestern towns that seemed frozen in time, with a main street full of family-owned shops and churches on every corner. I found the therapy office mentioned in the credit card statements, a small building attached to a larger medical complex. The receptionist, a kind-looking woman in her 50s, smiled at me when I walked in, and I felt my carefully prepared story evaporate. Instead, I found myself telling her a version of the truth, that I was looking for my sister, who I had been separated from as a child, that I had reason to believe she was a patient here. The receptionist's smile turned sympathetic but firm as she explained that she couldn't give out any patient information, that privacy laws prevented her from even confirming if someone was a patient. I understood, I told her, but could she perhaps pass along a note if someone named Grace Henderson happened to come in? I spent that night in a motel on the edge of town, staring at the water-stained ceiling and wondering if I had made a terrible mistake. But the next morning, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Lisa Brennan, a social worker at a residential facility outside of town. She had gotten my note from the therapy office and thought we should meet. Lisa was younger than I expected, probably only a few years older than me, with kind eyes and a careful way of speaking that suggested she was used to delivering difficult news. She told me that she had been working with a resident named Grace for several years, a woman who had been in and out of various facilities since she was 13. Grace had been brought in originally as a Jane Doe, clearly traumatized and suffering from severe dissociative episodes. The woman who had brought her in had claimed to be an aunt, had provided documentation that later turned out to be forged, and had paid cash for her care before disappearing. That woman's name, according to the intake forms Lisa had pulled, was Margaret Coleman, which was our mother's maiden name. I didn't even try to hide my reaction, and Lisa's expression softened. She had suspected for years that Grace's story didn't add up, that whoever had left her there had been hiding something significant. But Grace had been too unwell in those early years to provide any clarity, and by the time she had stabilized, the trail had gone cold. Lisa offered to take me to see Grace, warning me that it might be overwhelming for both of us. Grace had made significant progress over the years, she explained, but she still struggled with certain triggers and had difficulty trusting new people. She had never mentioned having a twin sister, which made Lisa wonder what else had been kept from her. The drive to the facility was short but felt eternal, my heart pounding so hard I was sure Lisa could hear it. The facility looked more like a large farmhouse than an institution, with gardens and walking paths and residents sitting on benches enjoying the spring weather. Lisa led me to a small visiting room with comfortable chairs and soft lighting, nothing like the sterile hospital settings I had imagined. She asked me to wait while she prepared Grace for the visit, warning me that it might take some time. I sat in that room for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. My hands clenched in my lap and my mind racing through everything I wanted to say. Then the door opened, and there she was. Grace, my twin sister, my other half standing in the doorway like she wasn't sure whether to come in or run away. She was thin, too thin, and her hair was shorter than mine, but the face looking back at me was like looking in a mirror that reflected who I might have been in another life. We stood there staring at each other for a long moment before Grace spoke, her voice exactly as I remembered, but with an underlying tremor that hadn't been there before. She said my name like a question, like she couldn't quite believe I was real, and that broke whatever dam had been holding back my emotions. I crossed the room in 3 steps and pulled her into a hug, both of us crying and holding on like we were afraid the other might disappear. When we finally sat down, still holding hands because neither of us could bear to let go completely, the words came pouring out. I told her about the letters, about Margaret's journal, about the years I had spent thinking she was dead. Grace listened with tears streaming down her face, occasionally squeezing my hand like she needed to reassure herself I was really there. When I finished, she took a shaky breath and began to tell me her side of the story. Grace's memories of our childhood were fragmented, broken up by what she now knew were early signs of the mental illness that would later consume her. She remembered the day with the neighbour's baby, though not in the way Margaret's journal had described. The baby had been crying, and Grace had been trying to help, to soothe it the way she had seen adults do. But something had gone wrong in her mind, like a switch flipping, and suddenly she couldn't control her movements. The baby had been hurt, though Grace insisted it hadn't died despite what Margaret had written. But the family had threatened to press charges, to have Grace locked away, and Margaret had panicked. Grace remembered the day of our supposed walk home, though her version was different from both the official story and Margaret's journal. She had been having one of her episodes, seeing things that weren't there, hearing voices that told her terrible things. Margaret had found her in that state and made a split-second decision. She had given me something to make me sleep, then taken Grace away while staging a scene to make it look like an abduction. When Grace next had clear memories, she was in a facility hundreds of miles away with a new name and no way to contact anyone from her old life. The years that followed were a blur of medications and therapies and institutions, each one promising to fix what was broken in her mind. Margaret visited sporadically in those early years, always alone, always with cash to pay for continued care. She told Grace that I had been so traumatized by the abduction that I couldn't handle knowing she was alive, that it was better for everyone if Grace remained dead to the world. And Grace, sick and scared, and dependent on the medications that kept the worst of her symptoms at bay, had believed her. As Grace talked, filling in the gaps of 23 years of separation, I felt rage building in my chest like a physical thing. Margaret had stolen our lives from us, had decided unilaterally that separation was better than facing the truth. She had condemned Grace to a life of institutions and isolation, while leaving me to grieve a loss that had never really happened. All in the name of protection, of keeping us safe from consequences that might never have materialized if she had just gotten Grace proper help from the beginning. But there was more to the story, Grace told me as the afternoon wore on. About a year ago, during a particularly good period in her treatment, she had overheard 2 staff members discussing another resident who had been placed there under similar circumstances. That had started her wondering about her own situation, about the aunt who had disappeared, and the family she couldn't quite remember. She had started keeping notes, trying to piece together the fragments of her past, and had made a disturbing discovery. There were references in her medical files to a third party, someone other than Margaret, who had shown interest in her case from the very beginning. This person, identified only by the initials RW, in the records, had apparently been providing additional funding for Grace's care and had requested regular updates on her progress. Grace had assumed it was some kind of charitable benefactor, but recently she had begun to wonder if there was more to it. Lisa, who had been sitting quietly in the corner throughout our reunion, spoke up then. She had noticed the same references in Grace's files and had done some investigating of her own. What she had found was troubling. Several other residents at various facilities in the area had similar mysterious benefactors, all identified only by initials, all requesting detailed medical updates. It seemed like someone was tracking these vulnerable individuals for reasons unknown. That's when Grace dropped the biggest bombshell of all. 2 weeks ago, during one of Margaret's rare visits, she had been drinking and more emotional than usual. She had started crying and apologizing, saying she had failed all three of us. When Grace had pressed her about what she meant by three, Margaret had let slip that there had been another sister, someone named Catherine, who had been born before us and given up for adoption. I felt like the world had tilted off its axis. 3 sisters, not just Grace and me, but a third sister we had never known existed. My mind raced back through every memory, every family photo, every story Margaret had told about our early years, looking for signs I might have missed. How many more lies had she told? How many more secrets were buried in that house in Denver? Grace and I talked until the facility's visiting hours ended, making plans to meet again the next day. Lisa gave me information about local hotels and her direct phone number, telling me to call if I needed anything. As I drove away from the facility, my mind was spinning with everything I had learned. I needed to go back to Denver, to confront Margaret with what I knew, and demand the truth about Catherine and everything else she had hidden from us. But first, I sat in my rental car in the parking lot and called the one person I thought might be able to help. My mother's younger sister, Patricia, lived in Phoenix and had always been the black sheep of the family, the one who asked uncomfortable questions and refused to go along with polite fictions. If anyone would know about a third sister, it would be her. Patricia answered on the third ring, her voice warm and surprised to hear from me. We had never been close, partly because Margaret had always kept her at arm's length, but she had always sent birthday cards and Christmas gifts, maintaining a thread of connection despite the distance. I told her I was looking into some family history and wondered if she knew anything about Margaret having a baby before Grace and me. The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long, I thought we had been disconnected. Then Patricia sighed, a sound full of years of unspoken knowledge, and told me she had wondered when someone would finally ask. Yes, she said, there had been another baby, born when Margaret was barely 19. The father had been some boy from college who had disappeared as soon as he found out Margaret was pregnant, and their parents had insisted on adoption to avoid scandal. Patricia had been only 12 at the time, but she remembered the day they took the baby away, how Margaret had screamed and fought until they had to sedate her. The adoption had been closed, sealed, with no information exchanged between the birth mother and the adoptive family. Margaret had gone back to college and never spoke of it again, but Patricia had seen how it had changed her, how she had become controlling and secretive, as if she could prevent future losses by managing every aspect of her life. When Margaret had gotten pregnant with twins years later, after marrying our father, who had died when we were just toddlers, Patricia had hoped it would heal some of that old wound. Instead, it seemed to have made Margaret even more protective, even more determined to keep her children safe from a world she saw as fundamentally threatening. Patricia had tried to maintain a relationship with us, but Margaret had always found excuses to keep us apart, and eventually Patricia had stopped trying. I thanked Patricia for her honesty and promised to keep in touch, then sat in the darkening parking lot trying to process this new information. Three sisters separated by adoption, death that wasn't death, and lies upon lies. I thought about Catherine, whoever and wherever she was, living her life without knowing she had two sisters who had just found each other. Did she ever feel that same emptiness that had haunted me? Did she wonder about her birth family, or had her adoptive parents given her a life complete enough that she didn't feel the need to search? I drove back to Denver the next morning, my head full of plans and questions, and a burning need for answers. Margaret's car was in the driveway when I arrived, 3 days earlier than she had said she would return. I found her in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, looking older and more fragile than I had ever seen her. She looked up when I walked in, and I saw in her eyes that she knew where I had been, what I had discovered, that the elaborate house of cards she had built was finally collapsing. Without a word, I sat down across from her and placed the adoption letter from Patricia on the table between us. Margaret stared at it for a long moment, then began to speak in a voice barely above a whisper. The story she told me then was different from anything I had imagined, darker and more complex than simple overprotection or misguided love. Yes, there had been a baby named Catherine, given up for adoption when Margaret was too young and powerless to fight for her. Yes, she had faked Grace's death to prevent her from being institutionalized after the incident with the neighbor's child. But there was more, so much more that she had never told anyone. Margaret spoke of a woman named Rebecca Walsh, a researcher who had been working with troubled children in the area when Grace first began showing signs of mental illness. This woman had shown unusual interest in Grace, offering free experimental treatments that promised to cure her condition. Margaret had been desperate enough to consider it until she discovered that Rebecca had shown similar interest in other children who had subsequently disappeared. That discovery, combined with the incident with the neighbor's baby, had prompted Margaret's drastic decision to fake Grace's death and hide her away. But Rebecca hadn't given up easily. She had approached Margaret multiple times over the years, suggesting that she knew Grace was alive and offering increasingly large sums of money for access to her. Margaret had moved us to Denver, partly to get away from Rebecca's influence, but she suspected the woman had never stopped searching. Those mysterious benefactor payments to Grace's facilities that Lisa had discovered were probably from Rebecca, still tracking Grace after all these years. As for Catherine, Margaret had tried to find her when Grace and I were about 5, hiring a private investigator to circumvent the sealed adoption records. What he had discovered had terrified her into never trying again. The adoptive family had connections to Rebecca Walsh's research program, and there were indications that Catherine had been specifically selected for reasons that had nothing to do with providing a loving home for an unwanted baby. Margaret had realized then that all 3 of her daughters were somehow caught in Rebecca's web, and she had done everything in her power to keep us apart and safe. I listened to this story with growing horror and skepticism in equal measure. It sounded like paranoid delusion, the kind of conspiracy theory that grief-stricken mothers might construct to explain away their failures. But then Margaret showed me the evidence she had collected over the years, newspaper clippings about missing children in areas where Rebecca had worked, printed emails from the private investigator, photos of Rebecca at various child welfare conferences, always lurking in the background of group shots. The picture that emerged was of a woman obsessed with studying genetic factors in childhood mental illness, particularly in siblings and twins. She had used her position to gain access to vulnerable children, especially those from families with histories of mental health issues. Some of these children had disappeared entirely. Others had been placed in facilities where they could be monitored long-term. And somehow, whether by terrible coincidence or careful design, all 3 of Margaret's daughters had come to her attention. I didn't know what to believe anymore. Was Margaret a protective mother who had made impossible choices to save her children, or a paranoid woman whose delusions had destroyed our family? Was Rebecca Walsh a predatory researcher or just a convenient boogeyman to explain away Margaret's actions? And where in all of this was the truth about who we really were and why we had been separated? Margaret pulled out a folder she had hidden in the kitchen pantry, behind boxes of pasta and canned goods. Inside were adoption records she had managed to obtain through less than legal means, showing that Catherine had been adopted by a family named the Morgans in Minneapolis. The most recent information, gathered just 6 months ago, indicated that Catherine was now 35 years old, worked as a social worker specializing in child welfare cases, and had no idea she was adopted. The irony wasn't lost on me. Catherine had dedicated her life to protecting children, possibly driven by the same instincts that had made Margaret go to such extremes. I wondered if she felt that same sense of incompleteness that had haunted me, if she had that same feeling of searching for something she couldn't name. Margaret begged me not to contact her, saying it would only put her in danger if Rebecca was still watching, but I was done with secrets and lies and living in fear of shadows that might not even be real. That night, I called Grace from my childhood bedroom, telling her everything Margaret had revealed. She listened quietly, occasionally asking clarifying questions, processing this new layer of complexity in our already complicated story. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. She had been thinking about those initials in her files, she said, and something had occurred to her. What if RW wasn't Rebecca Walsh but someone else entirely? What if Margaret had been wrong about who was watching us all these years? The thought sent chills down my spine. If Margaret had been wrong about Rebecca, what else had she been wrong about? How many of our family's tragedies had been based on misunderstandings and false assumptions? Grace and I agreed that we needed to find out the truth, not just for ourselves, but for Catherine too. She deserved to know she had sisters, deserved to make her own choices about whether to be part of our lives. I spent the next week researching, using every tool at my disposal to track down information about Rebecca Walsh and her research. What I found was disturbing, but not in the way Margaret had suggested. Rebecca had indeed been a researcher studying genetic factors in childhood mental illness, but her work had been legitimate and peer-reviewed. She had left the field abruptly in 2001 after some kind of scandal involving research ethics. But there was no indication she had ever harmed children or operated some kind of shadow network of facilities. The more I dug, the more convinced I became that Margaret's paranoia had created a villain, where there was only a woman doing controversial but legal research. But that raised even more questions. If Rebecca wasn't the threat Margaret believed her to be, why had someone been monitoring Grace all these years? Who was paying for additional care at her facility, and why did they want regular updates on her progress? Grace, meanwhile, had been doing her own investigation from inside the facility. With Lisa's help, she had gained access to more of her records and discovered something shocking. The payments hadn't started until 5 years after she had been placed in the facility, right around the time she had turned 18. The timing seemed significant, but neither of us could figure out why. Lisa had a theory that it might be related to some kind of trust fund or inheritance that kicked in when Grace reached adulthood, but that didn't explain the requests for medical updates. I decided it was time to take more direct action. Using the information Margaret had gathered, I reached out to Catherine through her work email, crafting a carefully worded message that wouldn't seem too alarming if she didn't know about her adoption. I introduced myself as someone researching family histories and genetic patterns in mental health, which wasn't entirely a lie, and asked if she would be willing to discuss her family's experiences. Her response came within hours, professional but curious. She said she would be happy to help with research that might benefit families dealing with mental health challenges. We arranged a phone call for the following day, and I spent the night planning what to say, how to ease into the revelation that would change her life forever. But as it turned out, I didn't need to be so careful. Catherine knew she was adopted. Her parents had told her when she was young, had always been open about it, though they claimed to have no information about her birth family due to the closed nature of the adoption. She had considered searching at various points in her life, but had always decided against it, partly out of loyalty to the parents who had raised her, and partly out of fear of what she might find. But lately, she admitted, she had been feeling a pull to explore her origins, especially after some strange incidents at work. Those incidents, she explained, involved cases that seemed to mysteriously resolve themselves just as she was getting involved. Foster children would suddenly have distant relatives appear to claim them, or funding would materialize from anonymous donors for exactly the services a family needed. At first, she had thought it was just good luck, but the pattern had become too consistent to ignore. Someone seemed to be watching her work and intervening when necessary, someone with resources and connections she couldn't trace. My heart was pounding as I realized the implications. Someone was watching Catherine just as they had been watching Grace, but instead of monitoring her medical status, they were monitoring her professional activities. I made a split-second decision and told her the truth. All of it, from our separation as children to my recent discovery of her existence. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, quick and shallow, as she processed what I was telling her. When I finished, she was quiet for so long I thought she might have hung up. Then she asked, in a voice that shook only slightly, if I had any proof. I emailed her photos of Grace and me, copies of Margaret's journal entries, the adoption records Margaret had obtained. I could hear her typing, opening files, gasping softly as she saw faces that looked like her own, staring back from the screen. We talked for 3 hours that night, comparing notes on our lives and looking for patterns. Catherine had always been drawn to child welfare work, but had never understood why it felt so personal to her. She had recurring dreams about sisters she didn't have, had always felt like she was meant to be protecting someone specific, but didn't know who. Even her husband had commented on how she seemed to be searching for something in every case she took on. By the end of our conversation, we had agreed to meet in person. Catherine would fly to Denver that weekend, and I would arrange for Grace to join us if the facility would allow it. It was time for the 3 sisters to be in the same room for the first time in 35 years, to piece together the truth of our separation and figure out who had been watching us all this time. Margaret was terrified when I told her the plan, begging us to reconsider, but her protests fell on deaf ears. We were done living in fear of shadows and suppositions. The reunion took place at a small hotel conference room I had rented for privacy. Grace arrived first with Lisa, looking nervous but determined. When Catherine walked in, we all froze, staring at each other with recognition that went beyond mere physical resemblance. We didn't look identical. The years and different lives had seen to that. But there was something unmistakable in the way we moved, the way we tilted our heads when thinking, the way our hands gestured when we talked. Catherine was the first to break the silence, crossing the room to pull both Grace and me into a hug that felt like coming home. We stood there crying and laughing and holding each other, 3 pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. When we finally sat down, still reaching out to touch each other as if to make sure we were real, the questions came pouring out. Catherine told us about her childhood, which had been happy and stable in all the ways ours hadn't been. Her adoptive parents were good people who had given her every opportunity, though she had always felt slightly out of step with her adoptive siblings. She had excelled in school, particularly in subjects involving pattern recognition and analysis, skills that served her well in her current work. But there had always been what she called blank spaces in her sense of self, areas where identity should be but wasn't. Grace shared more details about her years in various facilities, the slow process of finding the right combination of medications and therapies to manage her condition. She spoke about the isolation of being hidden away, of knowing something was wrong with the story she had been told, but being too sick and too dependent to challenge it. The mysterious benefactor payments had allowed her to access better care than she otherwise could have afforded, but they had also made her feel like a specimen being observed. As we talked, patterns began to emerge. All 3 of us had above-average intelligence and strong intuitive abilities. We all experienced what Catherine called environmental sensitivity, being highly attuned to the emotions and energies of people around us. Grace's mental illness had amplified this sensitivity to an unbearable degree, while Catherine and I had learned to manage it in different ways. We all had the same recurring dreams, the same sense of searching for something we couldn't name. Lisa, who had been taking notes throughout our conversation, suddenly looked up with a startled expression. She had been researching Rebecca Walsh on her phone while we talked, going deeper into academic databases than I had been able to access. What she found changed everything we thought we knew. Rebecca Walsh hadn't left her research voluntarily. She had been forced out after other researchers discovered she was falsifying data to support her theories about genetic markers for psychic sensitivity in children. According to the articles Lisa found, Rebecca believed that certain children possessed latent telepathic abilities that were strongest between biological siblings, particularly twins and triplets. Her research had been dismissed as pseudoscience, but she had continued to pursue it independently, funded by a small group of believers who thought her work could revolutionize our understanding of human consciousness. The scandal that ended her career had involved unauthorized experiments on siblings who had been separated by adoption or foster care. We sat in stunned silence as the implications sank in. Margaret's paranoia suddenly seemed less paranoid. If Rebecca had known about us, three sisters with whatever genetic quirk had made us interesting to her, we would have been irresistible subjects for her underground research. Margaret's drastic actions to separate and hide us might have actually saved us from becoming unwilling participants in experiments we couldn't imagine. But that still didn't answer the question of who was monitoring us now. Rebecca would be in her 70s by now if she was even still alive. Who else knew about us? Who had the resources to pay for Grace's care and monitor Catherine's career? And what did they want from us after all these years? As if in answer to our questions, Lisa's phone rang. It was the facility calling to say that a woman had shown up claiming to be Grace's aunt and demanding to see her. The woman had documentation that seemed legitimate, but something about her manner had made the staff suspicious enough to call Lisa. Grace went pale at the news. In all her years at various facilities, no one claiming to be family had ever tried to visit except for Margaret. Lisa put the call on speaker so we could all hear as she asked for a description of the woman. Elderly, well-dressed, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. She had introduced herself as Rebecca Walsh Coleman, claiming to be Margaret's cousin and Grace's closest living relative besides her mother. My blood ran cold. Coleman was Margaret's maiden name, the one she had used when placing Grace in the facility. Either this woman had done extensive research into our family, or she actually was some kind of relative we didn't know about. Lisa told the facility to stall the woman while we figured out what to do, but we all knew we couldn't avoid this confrontation forever. Catherine, ever the social worker, took charge. She suggested we call Margaret and find out if she actually had a cousin named Rebecca. If not, we would know this was the Rebecca Walsh we had been discussing, using a false identity to gain access to Grace. If she was a real relative, we needed to know why she had waited 23 years to make contact and what she wanted now. Margaret answered on the first ring, sounding anxious. When I asked about a cousin named Rebecca Walsh Coleman, there was a long pause before she admitted the truth. Rebecca Walsh was indeed her cousin, older by about 15 years. They had been close as children before Rebecca had gone off to study psychology and become obsessed with what the family politely called her unusual ideas. Margaret had cut contact with her years before we were born, disturbed by Rebecca's interest in studying family members for her research. When Rebecca had shown up after Grace's problems began, offering help and asking questions about all three of her daughters, Margaret had known immediately what she wanted. The family connection had made it impossible to get restraining orders or completely disappear, but Margaret had done her best to keep us off Rebecca's radar. Now it seemed her worst fears were coming true. Rebecca had found Grace and would probably find Catherine and me next. We had a decision to make. We could run, following Margaret's playbook of hiding and hoping Rebecca would give up. Or we could face her, find out what she wanted and why she had been watching us all these years. After a brief discussion, we chose to face her. We were adults now, not vulnerable children. We had each other, and we had the truth. Whatever Rebecca wanted, she would have to go through all three of us to get it. The facility agreed to arrange a meeting in a secure setting with staff present. Catherine insisted on being there in her professional capacity, while I would attend as Grace's newly discovered sister. We drove back to Illinois that evening, Margaret in tow despite our protestations. She was terrified, but determined to protect us from her cousin, even though we were no longer children who needed protecting. The meeting was scheduled for the next morning in the same visiting room where Grace and I had reunited. We arrived early, taking positions around the room like generals planning a battle. Lisa briefed the facility's security staff, making sure they understood that this visitor, while possibly a relative, was not to be left alone with Grace under any circumstances. Margaret paced by the window, looking older and more fragile with each passing minute. When Rebecca Walsh Coleman entered the room, I understood immediately why she had frightened Margaret so much. She carried herself with an authority that had nothing to do with age or status, her blue eyes taking in everything with an intensity that felt almost physical. She looked at each of us in turn, her gaze lingering longest on Grace, Catherine, and me, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She sat down without being invited, placing a leather folder on the table in front of her. Her first words were not what any of us expected. She apologized for the deception of using Margaret's maiden name, but said it had been necessary to gain access. She had been trying to reach out for years through proper channels, but Margaret had blocked every attempt. Now, with all three sisters finally together, she could complete the work she had started 40 years ago. Margaret stepped forward, placing herself between Rebecca and us, but Rebecca waved her away with a dismissive gesture. "This wasn't about Margaret," she said. "It had never been about her. It was about the extraordinary gifts that all three sisters possessed and the responsibility that came with those gifts." She opened her folder and spread out papers covered with charts and graphs, brain scans and genetic sequences, years of research compressed into neat clinical presentations. According to Rebecca, our family carried a rare genetic variation that created heightened neural connectivity, particularly in areas of the brain associated with empathy and intuition. In most carriers, this simply resulted in above-average emotional intelligence. But in some cases, particularly among siblings who shared the same variation, it could manifest as something more. She called it cognitive resonance, the ability to sense and sometimes share thoughts and emotions across distance. Grace's mental illness, Rebecca explained with clinical detachment, was likely the result of this sensitivity developing without proper guidance or shielding. Without understanding what was happening to her, young Grace had been overwhelmed by the thoughts and emotions of everyone around her, unable to distinguish between her own inner world and the mental noise of others. The incident with the neighbor's baby had probably been triggered by the child's distress, flooding Grace's unprepared nervous system. Catherine and I had been luckier, developing natural shields and coping mechanisms that allowed us to function in the world. But we had paid a price too, the constant feeling of incompleteness, the sense that part of us was missing. We had been unconsciously searching for each other our entire lives, our separated minds trying to reconnect across the void Margaret had created. It sounded like science fiction, the kind of thing that belonged in movies rather than real life. But as Rebecca talked, showing us brain scans from her legitimate research days and comparing them to the few medical images in Grace's files, I felt a strange sense of recognition. This explained so many things about my life, the way I could sense David's moods before he spoke, the dreams where I felt like I was living someone else's memories, the instant connection I had felt with both Grace and Catherine. Rebecca's research had been discredited not because it was wrong, but because she had pushed too hard, too fast, trying to prove something the scientific community wasn't ready to accept. The falsified data had been her desperate attempt to make her real findings more palatable, to hide the more extraordinary implications behind acceptable statistics. When that had failed, she had continued her work in secret, funded by families who had experienced similar phenomena and wanted answers. The monitoring of Grace and Catherine over the years hadn't been for some nefarious experimental purpose, Rebecca insisted. She had been trying to protect them from others who might exploit their abilities, while also gathering long-term data on how the trait manifested across separated siblings. The payments to Grace's facility had come from a trust fund established by several families involved in Rebecca's private research network. The interventions in Catherine's cases had been arranged to prevent her from unconsciously using her abilities in ways that might attract the wrong kind of attention. Margaret broke in then, her voice shaking with years of suppressed anger. She accused Rebecca of destroying our lives with her obsession of turning her children into lab rats for theories no respectable scientist would support. Rebecca's response was surprisingly gentle. She acknowledged the pain her interest had caused, but insisted that hiding from the truth had caused just as much damage. Margaret's fear had separated sisters who were meant to be together, had denied them the understanding and training that might have prevented Grace's breakdown. As they argued, I found myself watching my sisters. Grace had her eyes closed, her breathing steady in the meditation technique she had learned to manage overwhelming situations. Catherine was taking notes with the focused intensity she probably brought to all her cases, analyzing and categorizing information even as her world shifted around her. I felt a strange warmth in my chest, a sense of connection that seemed to pulse between the three of us. Without conscious thought, I reached for their hands. The moment we made contact, something extraordinary happened. The room seemed to fade around us, and for just a moment, I could feel what they were feeling. Grace's swirling mix of hope and fear, carefully controlled but still powerful. Catherine's analytical mind racing through possibilities, undergirded by a deep well of loneliness I hadn't expected. And from both of them, I felt an echo of my own emotions reflected back, amplified and clarified by their presence. The connection lasted only seconds before Grace pulled away, gasping, but it had been enough. We looked at each other with new understanding, knowing without words that Rebecca's theories, however fantastic they sounded, had truth at their core. Whatever genetic quirk or evolutionary adaptation we carried, it was real, and it was stronger when we were together. Rebecca watched us with the satisfied expression of a researcher whose hypothesis had been confirmed. This was what she had been waiting to see, she said. The connection that Margaret's well-meaning interference had severed, finally restored. With proper training and support, we could learn to manage and direct these abilities instead of being overwhelmed by them. She had resources, other families like ours who had learned to live with their gifts, a whole community we could join if we chose. But Catherine, ever practical, had questions. If these abilities were real and genetic, what about their children? She had 2 young daughters of her own, and the thought of them potentially facing what Grace had endured terrified her. Rebecca admitted that the trait did seem to run in families, though it didn't always manifest in every generation. Catherine's daughters would need to be monitored for signs of sensitivity, but forewarned was forearmed. They could be taught from an early age to shield and ground themselves, to see their sensitivity as a gift rather than a curse. Grace wanted to know if there were others like her, people whose abilities had manifested as mental illness before they understood what was happening. Rebecca's expression grew somber as she confirmed that yes, many of the people in psychiatric facilities might be undiagnosed sensitives, overwhelmed by input they couldn't process or control. Part of her underground research network worked to identify and help such individuals, though the psychiatric establishment's skepticism made it difficult. Margaret had been silent during this exchange, but I could see her processing everything, re-evaluating decades of decisions in light of new information. Finally, she asked the question I think we all were wondering. If Rebecca had known all along what we were, why hadn't she tried harder to help when Grace first showed symptoms? Why let Margaret's fear drive her away instead of fighting for the children she claimed to want to protect? Rebecca's composed mask slipped for just a moment, showing genuine regret underneath. She had been younger then, she said, still trying to work within the system that would eventually reject her. She had believed that Margaret would come around, that Grace's deteriorating condition would force her to accept help. By the time she realized Margaret would rather fake a death than accept Rebecca's assistance, it was too late. The die was cast, the sisters separated, and all she could do was watch from a distance and try to minimize the damage. The room fell silent as we absorbed this information, years of pain and separation that might have been avoided if the adults in our lives had made different choices. But there was no changing the past, no matter how much we might wish otherwise. The question now was what to do with our future, how to move forward with this new understanding of ourselves and each other. Rebecca made her pitch carefully. She wanted to document our reunion and our developing connection for her research, but this time with full consent and participation. She offered resources, training in managing our abilities, connections to others like us. In exchange, she wanted permission to publish our story, anonymized but authentic, as vindication of the work that had cost her her career. It was tempting in some ways. The idea of understanding these strange experiences that had haunted my life, of having a community of people who wouldn't think I was crazy for knowing things I shouldn't know. But I could also see the dangers, the way Rebecca's obsession with proving her theories might override concern for our well-being. We needed time to think, to process everything we had learned, and decide for ourselves what came next. We left the facility that day with no promises made, but with Rebecca's contact information and a standing offer of assistance. The drive back to Denver was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Grace returned to her facility, but with plans to transition to outpatient treatment now that she had family support. Catherine went home to her husband and daughters, promising to stay in close touch as we figured things out together. And I went back to Margaret's house, where we would have to find a new way to relate to each other now that the walls of secrecy had come down. The next few months were a whirlwind of change and adjustment. Grace began the slow process of transitioning to independent living, moving into a supervised apartment near the facility where she could continue her treatment while building a real life. I found a job in Denver and my own apartment, close enough to help Grace, but far enough to maintain healthy boundaries. Catherine visited regularly, bringing her daughters to meet their aunts, and watching carefully for any signs of inherited sensitivity. We experimented cautiously with our connection, learning to open and close it at will rather than being ambushed by sudden waves of each other's emotions. It was strongest when we were physically together, but even across distance, we could sense major emotional shifts or moments of crisis. Grace found that the connection actually helped her mental health, providing an anchor to reality when her own perceptions became unreliable. Catherine used it to enhance her already strong intuitive abilities in her work, knowing instinctively which cases needed her most urgent attention. Margaret and I slowly rebuilt our relationship on a foundation of truth rather than lies. She joined a support group for families affected by mental illness, finally processing the trauma and guilt she had carried for decades. She even reached out to Patricia, her sister, beginning to repair the family connections her fear had severed. The process was painful and sometimes contentious, but it was real in a way our previous relationship had never been. Rebecca continued to hover at the edges of our lives, sending research articles and invitations to join her network. We took what was useful and ignored the rest, determined to define our own path rather than become subjects in someone else's experiment. Some of her resource proved invaluable, particularly connections to other adult siblings discovering similar abilities. But we maintained careful boundaries, unwilling to trade Margaret's protective cage for Rebecca's research protocols. One unexpected development was the response to Catherine's anonymous blog about our experiences. She had started writing it as a way to process everything that had happened, changing names and details but keeping the emotional truth intact. The blog struck a chord with hundreds of people who had always felt different, who had experienced connections they couldn't explain or been labelled mentally ill for perceptions that didn't fit the accepted reality. Through the blog, we connected with other separated siblings who had found each other, families dealing with sensitive children, and individuals struggling to understand their own heightened perceptions. It became a community of sorts, people supporting each other through the challenges of living with abilities that science couldn't quite explain and society didn't quite accept. Rebecca watched from the sidelines, occasionally commenting under an obvious pseudonym, but the community grew beyond her influence or control. Grace's recovery accelerated once she had context for her experiences. Understanding that she wasn't broken, just overwhelmed by a sensitivity she hadn't known how to manage, allowed her to reframe her entire life story. She still needed medication and therapy, but now she was working with her condition instead of against it. She began volunteering at the facility where she had lived, helping other residents who might be dealing with similar sensitivities. A year after our reunion, we received a message that shocked us all. A woman in Seattle had seen Catherine's blog and believed she might be another sister. The details didn't match. She was too young to be another of Margaret's children, but she had been adopted as a baby and had always felt an inexplicable connection to Denver and the name Grace. We were skeptical, but when she sent a photo, the resemblance was unmistakable. Investigation revealed that she was actually Rebecca's daughter, given up for adoption when Rebecca's career imploded and she couldn't provide a stable home. Rebecca had been monitoring her own daughter all these years alongside us, but had never revealed the connection. When confronted, Rebecca broke down completely, admitting that her obsession with our family had cost her own child, that she had been trying to understand and help us as a way of atoning for abandoning her daughter. The revelation changed our relationship with Rebecca entirely. She wasn't just a researcher fascinated by our abilities. She was a mother who had lost her child and spent decades trying to make amends through proxy. Her daughter, Anna, was understandably angry and confused, but we welcomed her into our strange extended family, another piece of the puzzle we hadn't known was missing. The integration wasn't smooth. Anna had her own heightened sensitivities but no siblings to connect with, leaving her feeling even more isolated than we had been. She resented Rebecca for choosing research over raising her, resented us for unknowingly taking her mother's attention. But gradually, as she spent time with us and experienced the connection we shared, she began to understand both what she had missed and what she might still gain. 2 years after finding each other, the four of us stood together at Grace's wedding to a fellow sensitive she had met through our community. Catherine's daughters were flower girls, their own emerging sensitivities carefully nurtured rather than feared. Margaret sat in the front row next to Patricia, tears streaming down her face as she watched the daughter she had hidden away building a life in the open. Even Rebecca was there, older and humbled, but finally part of the family she had studied from afar for so long. During the reception, as Grace and her new husband danced, I felt our connection open fully for the first time, without fear or reservation. 4 minds touching, sharing joy and hope, and the complex love that comes from knowing each other's deepest pain and choosing connection anyway. We were no longer the separated sisters, victims of fear and misunderstanding. We were a family, complicated and scarred, but whole in a way none of us had imagined possible. The journey from that first credit card statement to this moment of celebration had been longer and stranger than any fiction I could have invented. We had uncovered lies that spanned decades, abilities that challenged conventional understanding, and connections that transcended physical distance. But most importantly, we had found each other, and in doing so, had found ourselves. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, the four of us gathered on the venue's terrace, looking out at the lights of the city below. Anna raised a toast to the strange paths that had brought us together, to the mothers who had failed us in trying to protect us, and to the future we were building on our own terms. We drank to secrets revealed and connections restored, to the family we had lost and the larger family we had found. Catherine pulled out her phone to show us the latest statistics from her blog, now reaching thousands of people around the world. Support groups were forming in major cities. Researchers were beginning to take serious interest in studying these connections with proper ethical oversight, and families were learning to nurture rather than fear their sensitive children. What had started as our personal journey had become something larger, a movement toward understanding and accepting the full spectrum of human perception and connection. Grace's new husband joined us on the terrace, and I watched as she unconsciously opened her shield to include him in our connection. He had his own abilities, different from ours but complementary, and their bond added a new dimension to our network. This was the future, I realized, not isolated individuals struggling to understand themselves, but connected communities supporting each other through the challenges and gifts of expanded awareness. Margaret appeared in the doorway, hesitant to intrude on our moment. But Grace reached out to her, pulling her into our circle with the forgiveness that had taken years to develop. We stood there together, 5 women bound by blood and choice and shared understanding, each carrying our own scars but no longer defined by them. The night air was cool around us, but the warmth of connection made it irrelevant. Later, as I drove home alone, I thought about the 10-year-old girl who had lost her twin sister and spent 23 years searching for something she couldn't name. If someone had told her that she would not only find Grace alive, but discover 2 more sisters and abilities that sounded like science fiction, she would have thought it was a cruel fantasy. But life, I had learned, was stranger and more wonderful than anything we could imagine when we stopped letting fear dictate our choices. I pulled into my apartment complex and saw a familiar car into the visitor's spot. David sat on my doorstep, looking uncertain but hopeful. We had been talking lately, carefully rebuilding a connection that had been damaged by secrets I hadn't even known I was keeping. He knew everything now, had even met my sisters and experienced a diluted version of our connection through proximity. The question was whether love could survive such radical truth. As I approached, he stood and smiled, holding out a book about twin studies and psychic phenomena with a bookmark sticking out halfway through. He was trying to understand, to meet me in this new reality where thoughts could be shared and sisters could sense each other across miles. It might not work, this attempt to bridge the gap between ordinary and extraordinary perception, but the fact that he was trying meant everything. We went inside together, and I made tea while he told me about the chapter he had just read, about studies showing that separated twins often lived parallel lives without knowing it. I thought about Grace in her new apartment, probably sensing my cautious hope. About Catherine tucking her daughters into bed with stories that included magic as possibility rather than fantasy. About Anna learning to navigate her abilities without the anchor of sibling connection. About Margaret learning to let go of control and trust the universe she had feared for so long. The future stretched out before us, uncertain but no longer terrifying. We had found each other against all odds, had reclaimed connections that were meant to be severed forever. Whatever challenges came next, we would face them together, supported by the bonds that had survived separation, lies, and decades of misunderstanding. We were sisters, in all the ordinary and extraordinary ways that word could mean, and that was enough. As I settled onto the couch next to David, my phone buzzed with a group text from my sisters, sharing the small moments of their evenings in the way we had learned to do when our mental connection felt too intense. Catherine's daughters had insisted on wearing their flower girl dresses to bed. Anna had successfully shielded herself during a crowded concert for the first time. Grace and her husband were watching the stars from their balcony, perfectly content in shared silence. I added my own update, that David was here and we were talking, that hope felt possible even if success wasn't guaranteed. The responses came immediately, hearts and encouragement, and the kind of unconditional support that only comes from people who truly know you. This was what Margaret had tried to protect us from, this vulnerability of being truly known. But it was also what she had stolen from us, the strength that comes from facing the world with others who understand. David asked if I was okay, noticing the tears I hadn't realized were falling. I told him I was more than okay, that I was complete in a way I had never imagined possible. He didn't entirely understand, might never fully grasp what it meant to be reunited with parts of yourself you didn't know were missing, but he held me while I cried anyway, and that was its own form of connection. Outside, the city hummed with millions of lives, millions of stories unfolding in parallel. Somewhere out there were other separated siblings finding each other, other families learning to embrace what made them different, other researchers working to understand the mysteries of human connection. We had started something that was bigger than just our family, had opened doors that couldn't be closed again. But for tonight, it was enough to sit in my small apartment with someone who loved me despite, or perhaps because of the strangeness I carried, to feel my sister's presence like distant stars in my consciousness, to know that tomorrow we would all wake up and continue building lives that honored both our gifts and our struggles. We had been broken apart by fear and brought together by truth, and in the end, that truth had set us free. The story that began with a credit card statement and a name that shouldn't have existed had become something else entirely, a testament to the power of connection and the resilience of love. We were no longer the hidden sisters, the separated ones, the victims of others' choices. We were Grace, Catherine, Anna, and Sarah, 4 women who had found each other across impossible odds and chosen to build something beautiful from the wreckage of our past. And in that choice, in that daily decision to remain open and connected despite the risks, we had found not just each other, but ourselves. The missing pieces had been recovered, the phantom pain had eased, and the search that had defined my life for 23 years had finally ended where it began, with sisters who were never truly gone, just waiting to be found. As the night deepened and the city quieted, I closed my eyes and reached out through our connection one more time, sending love and gratitude to the 3 women who had made me whole. The response came immediately, warm and sure and undeniable. We were family, bound by more than blood, stronger than separation, and nothing would ever tear us apart again.